Welcome to another edition of Throwing Down Some Heavy Light. My name is A'Jamal Byndon. I'm the chair of the board of Movement Omaha Race Equity, and we're in the audience today with guests we're going to have a conversation. Dr. Pat Velasquez, who's very much involved in issues related to social justice, race issues, and in higher education. So first, Pat, you guys, let's start off by telling a little bit more about yourself, and then we'll get into the interview.
Okay, first, let me say buenos dias or buenas tardes. My name is Patrick Velasquez. I'm third generation Chicano, born and raised in Omaha, Nebraska, and I lived there for over 30 years. Went through the public school system in Omaha, attended UNO for both my bachelor's and master's degrees, and then I moved to San Diego, California in 1989 and have been out here ever since. So San Diego's right on the U.S.-Mexico border. Mexico's literally about 20 minutes from where I live. And when I came out here, I went back to school, earned my PhD in higher education, and I worked for 28 years at one of the country's most racist institutions, the University of California at San Diego. Retired about 7 or 8 years ago, and I've still been involved with higher education issues. I consider that probably my area of expertise and the most experience. And I'm the co-chair of a community organization, a coalition called the San Diego Chicano Latino Concilio, or Council on Higher Education, where we try to advocate for maximum access and success among Chicano students in the public colleges and universities in San Diego. So that's my background.
Good, good. Excuse me. The first question I want to ask that we talk as we embark on moving into 2026, there are issues confronting Chicanos and immigrants in our respective communities across the country, obviously. One of the pressing issues as cited by social justice advocates deals with the concept of La Raza and so on and how we've been treated. And in your experience, Patrick, what are those key elements that help you to stay connected despite the temptation to ignore those racial and community issues that affect Latinos, and particularly in the academic community? Because we have a lot of people who go through the challenges and upbringings that we've experienced, but they sometimes lose their way. So help us with that concept and how you've been able to maintain this focus and beaten path of helping in the struggle.
I know we're going to talk a lot about advocacy today, community advocacy, and I think for the people who want to be activists, it's one of my friends used to say, it's not for everybody. Not everybody can be a community advocate or an activist. That's a reality. And if you are going to be a community activist or advocate for the Black community, for the Chicano community, whatever it might be, it really does take a lifelong commitment, and I think you have to make that kind of commitment from the jump, from the start. So I was very fortunate in having very strong mentors early in my life. They had a big impact on me in getting me grounded in community activism and advocacy. And I would say, one of the things I took away from my UNO education, believe it or not, was some background in community organizing that came out of the social work major that I was in as an undergraduate. So I feel like that's given me a big advantage over a lot of people that I work with, especially in higher education, where people are not trained to be advocates. They're not trained on how to organize. So that was a very important issue for me. The question you ask about staying focused on racial issues, even in a time like today, where I think you could make a good argument that racism is at an all-time high in the United States, even if people are not being lynched and killed out in the streets as much as they used to be. But I've been thinking a lot about this question because I recently read a book, and it's like a reprint, really. The name of the book is Race and Class in the Southwest and Other Essays, Studies in Political Economy. And what it is essentially the writings of a recently deceased Chicano scholar named Mario Barrera. As we say in Spanish, que en paz descanse, may he rest in peace. But he just passed away, I believe, last year. And to me, he's one of the greatest Chicano scholars in history. And I used one of his seminal works, this book, Race and Class in the Southwest. I used it a lot in my doctoral dissertation, which, man, believe it or not, has been like 30 years ago now. And in a nutshell, what Barrera was arguing is that you have to really consider both the hierarchy in the United States, the hierarchy of social class or socioeconomic class, and the hierarchy of race or racism in terms of understanding the sort of subordinate position that Chicanos occupy in the United States. And I think the same thing is true of the Black community. So I do sense there's a tension between some Chicanos that feel like, racism is a little bit, it's not what we should focus on. We should be focusing on social class. And I recently went to a professional conference where there were Chicanos from various parts of California and other parts of the country. And some of the folks there were socialists. And again, they were suggesting that focusing on anti-racism and struggles against racism is misguided. There
Hmm.
was even one speaker at the conference who said that anti-racism is an extension of neoliberalism,
Oh, wow.
which I
Wow.
just found stupid, just asinine, man.
Yeah.
And so I certainly recognize, as Barrera emphasized, I recognize that Chicanos are a subordinate social class as well as racial class or racial group in the hierarchies, and that we do have to pay attention and try to struggle against both. But the folks who are not focused on racism, the Chicanos who don't want to deal with racism, would rather deal with social class. I'm not sure that I see them accomplishing anything. I don't really even know how they measure progress. I don't know how practical it is to overthrow the United States government and install a socialist economic system. I'd be all for that. I certainly wouldn't mind seeing that, but I don't see people really making that happen. Again, I don't know how you even measure progress in that area. It's interesting that, as you know, the city of New York City, recently elected a mayor that is Muslim, that calls himself a social democrat. And that's cool. If he's able to incorporate some elements of socialism into the economy, the political economy of New York City, that would be great. And I'd really love to see that happen, in part just to see if it's successful, if we can make it work or not.
Hmm.
Um, One of the tensions that I see is that Chicanos who are, for example, saying, well, for me as a socialist, my main thing is I'm going to support unions. Well, some of the unions, at least here in Southern California, are majority Chicano Latino, like the janitors unions, I think perhaps some of the construction unions. But some of the unions throughout the United States are majority white.
Historically,
And
it's been that
there's
way.
one thing we know about the election of Donald Trump in 2016 and 2020. It was these non-college educated white rednecks that were his strongest base of electoral support, and the ones keeping him in office now as well.
Right.
So I'm not going to advocate for the welfare of white union members that are hardcore white supremacists and
Right.
racists. To me, that makes no sense. So, I think we all have to, as activists or advocates, we have to carve out a battleground. We have to choose on what battleground we fight. And for me, it's been in the area of higher education and in the area of trying to eliminate racism, institutional
Right.
racism.
Patrick, I was going to say there's about three quick points I'd make. Number one, you can measure the transformation of groups by their income, whether it be house ownership, education, transfers of wealth. And what happened is you have a lot of Latinos and other groups, elite Negroes and sellouts, who don't look at the empirical data of transfers of group dynamics. So again, it becomes like you can have a state like California being a majority Latinos or Hispanic Chicanos, but they don't have the political power or the sway or the income. So it's almost like we create these images. And again, if you go into many institutions in Omaha, we retreated back to the 1930s and 40s in terms of all white institutions. And again, you go to University of Nebraska, Omaha, Lincoln, the Medical Center, they got the same ratio of white racists and supremacists that they had when I was a kid. You'll see most of the people of color will be janitors or people like that. And even now they've brought in a lot of people from India or other places to do some of these jobs. But my point going back to we can measure it. And again, I understand you cannot separate, as Franz Fanon says, you can't separate race and class from each other because if you're born black, you're poor. If you're poor, you're black. And again, we can use the same argument with Native Americans and Latinos who live in this society. So you can't have someone who's at the bottom trying to all of a sudden say we can ignore the racism of the history that put us in this situation. But something hit me as you were talking, because you're talking about this author that I'm not familiar with, and you said he helped guide you. How would you compare his writings to Paulo Freire? Because Paulo Freire comes from a different angle of the banking concept, the struggle of people in Brazil and so on, and has a universal appeal. How does this author, the writer, compare, even though he's talking about higher education, to Paulo Freire's kind of earthy, gut level deconstruction of the racist? He used more economics than Paulo Freire, but he just the whole messed up system of education. How do you compare the two writers? Or can you?
Yeah, I would say they each had a different focus, and I think in Barrera, particularly his early scholarship, it was a historian,
Okay,
so he was focused on trying to explain the situation of Chicanos, why we occupy such a subordinate position, and why we have these material conditions around us that we see in terms of unemployment, underemployment, lack of educational achievement, segregated substandard housing, over policing,
right,
um, juvenile delinquency, etc., poor health care, lack of access to health care. All these things that there are some groups that are portrayed as oppressed groups, but they don't live in these kind of material conditions. They don't live in segregated communities that are marked by these kind of communities. So Barrera wanted to explain that. Yeah, he was also the co-author of a very powerful article that I read when I was a graduate assistant at UNO, and the article was called "The Barrio as an Internal Colony,"
mm,
and he had based a lot of it off a chapter. I think it was a chapter, if not a book, by Stokely Carmichael and Charles Hamilton called "The Ghetto is an Internal Colony," that was trying to explain the situation of the black community in the United States and what
right,
was the origins. So that was really Barrera's focus. Later on, he wrote a fascinating book, really really poignant book called Beyond Aslan, where he essentially said the United States should be broken up into ethnic autonomous regions. And so Freire, of course, was an educator, and his focus was much more tightly on education and even specific pedagogy. What do you do in the classroom?
okay, got you. So there's a dichotomy then, obviously,
Yeah,
that
yeah. How do you
one's a
help?
historian and one's an educator, and so they come at
Mhm.
the genre from different angles, and you have to kind of synthesize or get a symbiotic understanding of that. Let me
Yeah,
switch up again. I want to come specifically to we want to talk about the issue of the Trump administration. We're coming to the end of the year, and Trump has created havoc and chaos in our communities and throughout the world, and doing some wicked, evil stuff. But Trump's administration, of course, has been selective in targeting Mexicans, Latino migrants, and ignoring European refugees from Ukraine and Russia. And he's come out and just said that, even the way he shut down many of these African countries that are coming over here. He
mhm.
also gave refugee status to racist South Africans. Even some whites seem to resent such obvious racist policies. What is it that most whites in the United States don't know about the historical presence of Mexicans in the Southwest United States and the niche they occupy in our labor market? Because again, that's not taught in most of these plantation brainwashing education institutions that we have locally and nationally. So give us a more insight.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to say with a strong emphasis about all this. I know we're going to talk about the Trump administration, and obviously, make no mistake about it, Donald Trump is a piece of human feces, man. He's a scumbag, the worst kind of human being that you could imagine. However, he's not the problem. The problem is that the majority of voters in 2 elections now have voted him into office as
Right.
president. And again, we know that most of that is made up of a white supremacist base, the so-called non-college educated whites that can't think for themselves,
Right.
that obviously can't even tell who their allies are and who their adversaries are, along with a number of rock-headed, um, internally colonized Hispanics and other sellouts of color. But yeah, the immigration situation, man, it's really been terrible in terms of selective enforcement. The way that Trump is openly saying, he just said this at a rally a couple of days ago, that he wants to have more white European immigrants come to the United States. He's bemoaning the fact that there's so many people of color coming here. But if you see these really brutal, cruel immigration raids, where these fat immigration agents with their military gear and their masks and their sunglasses come rolling into a community with semi-automatic rifles, to arrest a woman who's a janitor in a hotel parking lot. This I've seen this on TV. Throw her to her knees and put her in handcuffs. Even some white people have said this is too much for me, man.
Right.
And
Right.
we had an incident here in San Diego at a restaurant in a predominantly white community, and the migra, as we call them, the ICE agents went into this restaurant, and there was about 20 of them. They arrested four busboys or cooks, Latino cooks, and drugged them off in handcuffs. And as they were leaving, a lot of the white folks who lived in this fairly upscale neighborhood went outside to see what was going on, and they got in the way of the ICE agents, and they yelled at them, they cursed at them. It ended up with the ICE agents throwing these stun grenades at some of these middle class white folks. And I thought, I see in San Diego in the news almost every day, there's some local police or local sheriff that are arresting people, and that never happens where people who live in the neighborhood come out and curse the cops or curse the sheriffs. So why are they doing it to the ICE agents? They're saying that this is even too outrageous for them.
Right.
What is not known by hardly any white folks in the entire United States is that in the Southwest, we're talking about territory that used to belong to Mexico.
Right.
California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, parts of Colorado, Nevada, Utah, etc. And this land was stolen from Mexico during the Mexican American War in the 1840s. And there's a very good expression that is said often here in Southern California, that nobody is illegal on stolen land.
Right.
And it was white settler colonists that came to the United, what's now the Americas, and stole the land that they now possess. Their ancestors stole the land, committed genocide against the native people who were there, stole half of Mexico's national territory, and basically reduced the Mexican people there to a source of cheap labor. And
Right.
make no mistake about it, man, the whole immigration issue for the white supremacists that are backing Trump, the whole issue is Mexicans. It's not anybody else. It was Trump when he announced him running for office in 2016, 2015, that talked about Mexicans being murderers and rapists. He didn't mention anybody else. So he called out to his base right then and there that he was going to focus on reducing the number of Mexicans in society. But over the years, Chicanos, Mexicanos have become an essential part of the labor market.
Mm.
A'Jamal, I can remember when I was living in Nebraska in the 1980s, and there was a lot of white folks who were saying, these Mexicans are coming here and taking their jobs, or taking our jobs. And I don't hear hardly any white people stupid enough or ignorant enough to say that anymore.
Right.
They know that these immigrants are coming to take the jobs that white folks will not work. They don't want to work. And so I think we all realize in cities like San Diego, that migrant labor is an essential part of the economy. It keeps prices down, it keeps businesses running, And that's why even some white folks who probably have a little bit of white supremacy themselves, they're going out even literally into the streets and trying to stick up for the Mexican migrants that are being brutally detained and basically, as they say, disappeared.
Well,
And
the other thing Pat was going to say is that I've seen where they've actually chased women to their house, and
mhm.
people who are legal residents, who are citizens born here. And then I was surprised in Nebraska, the ACLU brought to my attention, they even arrested a few Indians, Native
Yes,
Americans. I
yes.
mean, how do you arrest a Native American, or why would you have somebody who looks like a Gestapo thug, a criminal with a mask on their face and glasses? Again, there's some shops will not let you walk in with a ski mask on when you buying stuff. So how do we let somebody come into our community, want to be cage fighters, throw down women and children, and do the kind of stuff that's happening, the genocide in Israel, that kind of mentality in this country? And then you got people sitting around holding their, twisting their thumbs and so on. And the other issue that bothers us is that we have a history of oppression and we have a history of struggle. And it's surprising how people see this stuff and they act like it's not happening. And one of the things I've learned about the whole issue of Rwanda, Bosnia, Nazi Germany, you name it, even South Africa, this stuff didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process of them start doing what they're doing. And the thing I find strange or just ludicrous or crazy or just asinine is we can take a mom away from the child or vice versa in the middle of the day and there's no safety net. And again, you know, these thug people who are getting all this extra money from the government is to be mean and brutal. And again, how are you going to identify who did what if they don't have name badges and they also are getting to hide their faces? So I know what you're saying, but I'm really bothered by the ineptitude of folks who are saying it's not going to happen to me. And again, just recently, Patrick, you alluded to the Mexicans or Chicanos. He's done the same attack on the Somalis. I mean, he's calling people all these dirty names. And again, these are legal citizens. Some have been here for 2 or 3 generations. They came as refugees many years ago because of some of the conditions we created in both Central and South America and Africa. Again, and so these are issues we got to deal with. But uh, I have to say up front, we have freedom of speech and we should be able to speak to it. But I'm just amazed at the number of folks who will not bust a grape and they'll see this stuff happening and they know history is going to happen to other people and they won't say nothing about it.
Well, Ajmal, what do you think of this situation in which Donald Trump has said, the Trump administration has said that white people in South Africa are being brutally oppressed by the black South African government, and that he wants to welcome those white South Africans to the United States as refugees?
He's probably talking about the poor white folks. That at the most part, if you do a demographic understanding of the South African land wealth, whites have controlled majority of the land in South Africa, even though they're a small percentage of, let's say, less than 10%. And so again, they got it historically. And one of the things that you got people talking about today, Patrick, is that they think that you revisiting the whole transfer from when Mandela became president. Because again, if you have the history of the Land Act of 1913 in South Africa, you got all these places where they were getting people off their land who've been there for generations, kind of like the Southwest, the same mentality. You cannot go today and say, oh, this is happening when you know that it's not happening. Again, they've released data that show that, yes, there are people who are dying in South Africa, have one of the highest crime rates, but it's mostly Africans killing other Africans in that situation. And the whites who do get killed in a very small percentage is usually a domestic issue on their land or how they treated some of their farm workers with that same apartheid mentality. But what's unfortunate is Trump is dumber than a rock. Oh, sorry, Rock, I don't mean to insult you. But the fact is, he doesn't have any connections there. The South African embassy is full of, I'm sure, Southern white people who have that apartheid mentality from the South. And so my point I would argue is that he doesn't have the facts, and he never will have the facts because you can see the way he operates. He doesn't deal with facts. He make up stuff in the middle of the night and come up with stuff. And again, the same with Ukraine, you name it. He back and forth. The same with Israel. So Trump, you cannot leave any credibility or credence to what he says. And again, part of what he's doing, he's playing to his base, as you alluded to earlier. And again, I think part of the problem is our shoes are pinching, but some of us ain't got the wherewithal to get them tight shoes off and push back and fight these kind of leadership that is going in our community. But I think South Africa, in my experience of being that part of the world, you're not going to have justice and fairness unless you make sure those Africans who were born there for generations and centuries get access to their land and also the wealth. again, you talk about the wealth in South Africa. A lot of the gold and stuff went to the people who had apartheid system. So it's we just don't have a lot of education in this country about what happens in other parts of the world. And I think that's why this program is so important, Patrick, because they're not teaching us in our school systems. And obviously, when you talk about what happened in Central South America or in Mexico, a lot of the stuff that we're talking about is new to a lot of people who are so-called leaders or supposed to be educated.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you, and this goes back to my argument or my point about nonprofits. And I made this argument very well that you can get rid of 90% of our nonprofits in our communities of color. We won't miss them. I mean, I think that the COVID mentality is gotten to the point where we don't have the community forums, we don't engage, we don't have outcomes, we don't have strategic plans. And some of the people in leadership, I think, are literate or dumber than rocks. They can't read. Some people I've known for years, I've never seen one letter, one thing from them in writing. And so one question I was going to ask you, years ago, you were the director of the Chicano Awareness Center, and since that time, over 35 years ago, the institution has gone through profound changes. What advice would you offer to help community members to work on current racial justice issues and build coalition with people of color? And the reason I say that, Patrick, and I don't want to be funny, I can probably think of on one hand the number of Latinos, Native Americans, African Americans who feel comfortable doing advocacy across the tracks in our community. So we don't have unity. We've been divided as people of color, even though we face some of the same problems. So my question, actually, the essential element of the question is, how can we get our people to be more unified, which we have not been in this community? I suspect the same thing happens in other parts of the country. What advice would you have in light of your multicultural experience, not only here, but working in higher education in San Diego?
I think you have to find the issues, as you said, where we have commonality. When I was living in Omaha, we always coalesced at least a few members of the Black community and Chicano community and the Native American community around the issues of education,
Okay, that was a commonality.
particularly the quality of education that our students were getting in the Omaha public schools. And when it comes to advocacy, you know this very well, man. Like there's no substitute for data.
Right.
So we always looked at the data on student achievement, whether it was test scores. We used to look every year at the percentage of students of color that were leaving the Omaha public schools as graduates and moving into higher education. And there was always a significant gap between white students and the underrepresented communities of color and their students. So I think you need to zero in on the issues that affect all of us. I think all of our communities are over policed. There are issues with police brutality. I was able to work with, to some degree, with some folks from the Native American community and Black community to do training of Omaha Police Department officers when I was there. And again, the data that shows that our people are not promoted to areas of decision making in those institutions, that's also critical. So we need to zero in on the data. The data is not going to lie. But then the other thing we need to do is to be able to put these things in writing and to be able to get them out there in the public eye. And you and I have done some of that with the MORE organization,
Right.
which reports on UNO and Metro Community College about the extent to which they're serving underrepresented communities of color. So, if it's not in writing, for all practical purposes, it doesn't exist. So we need to find the problems. We need to either write about them, or if nothing else, use other means of communication. In this day and age, YouTube is a big deal. So I don't know, for instance, if the Latino Center of the Midlands has its own YouTube channel, or if they use that kind of media, podcasts and so forth, to be able to provide their analysis of inequality that affects the Chicano community. I don't know if the Urban League offices in North Omaha, if they have a YouTube channel or if they do podcasts, but there are multiple means to be able to get the word out about whether or not these institutions are serving our communities the way that they're supposed to. So those things have to be just doggedly pursued. And again, one of the keys to effective advocacy is just persistence.
You know what? I'll say something emphatically. I would be willing to bet $100 both the urban Latinos and the Midlands don't have any means of communicating to the masses about the struggle and advocacy. And again, we use the concept of reverse engineering. Look at conditions we face and look at the lack of voices in that community. So Patrick, what I'm basically saying is, all you do is look at the multitude of the chaos and the privacy of our respective groups. Somebody's not doing something. It all reminds me when I was a kid. My mother would go shopping and she would tell us to clean up the house. And when she come home and the house wasn't clean, we'll say, "Well, Mama, we cleaned it up." She said, "Well, look around. It ain't clean like it's supposed to be," or something like that. Or we'll have somebody on the lookout. So that she drive up and run in the house. We're outside playing. We try to clean up real quick. Well, the subterfuges and the mirages that exist in this community are very obvious. That our families are lack of good lunches, lack of income, a parity, housing, you name it. So at the end of the day, the question comes back to is what can they point to? And if you look at the absence in these conversations, excuse me, you won't hear any of that. So I would argue that no, nothing like that exists. But even it goes to our institution of higher education. I've not seen a social work student or a social work person in any North Omaha agenda doing anything of any major in like 15, 20 years. So if you got the higher education, whether it be UNO, Creighton University, College of St. Mary's, Bellevue University, and they never come into North and South Omaha, how can we talk about progress when obviously it doesn't? Again, you don't have to. You can be from anywhere in the country, the world, and see that our conditions is replicated because our leadership has gotten co-opted, bought out, and so on. I want to switch up because we're chasing time a little bit, and I want to ask you, Patrick, how important are international issues contrast to some of the domestic issues dealing with racial justice? Because there's some people who are very angry about those of us who focus on international issues, and there's some people who say we should only focus on domestic issues. How do you have that blend to know that you're working on helping our folks throughout the diaspora or whatever, wherever they come from, who are oppressed?
I think it's very important. I don't. I'm not sure we can quantify like how much attention do you devote to this and how much to that. There's an expression, as you know, that we should think globally and act
Right,
locally. And I think there is something to say for the ability to actually accomplish more change and more positive transformation at the local level. So I myself, that's where most of my focus is. But at the same time, I'm not going to ignore the international dimension of social justice. And I think we see this again. This might be about as bad a time as what we've ever seen, certainly in my lifetime, in terms of international genocide, oppression, colonialism, etc. I know here in Southern California, there's a number of Chicanos that have been very active and very committed to the cause of the Palestinian people in the face of the genocide that they're dealing with at the hands of the Israeli government. So I myself have been aligned with the people of Cuba, our brothers and sisters in Cuba, that have worked so hard to try to resist the United States imperialism and colonialism. And as we look and see now, it's hard for me, and I'm sure others that have any kind of consciousness and conscience, to not be concerned about what the United States is doing to Venezuela.
right. That's a
And
big issue
so,
too. Killing people, innocent people, they haven't identified, and they're making up these lies when again they talking about drugs. There's no due process, and now people are starting to push back, say you can't just kill people on international waters because you suspect them of drug dealing. I mean, if that's the case, it's like where have we become, a barbaric country? And obviously, it sounds somebody should be going to the international court, being tried for killing innocent people until we know exactly who's on those boats.
yeah, and yesterday the United States just seized a tanker from Venezuela, just stole like
Beef.
like bandits back in the old west, just blatantly stealing somebody's property. From my
Pirates.
understanding, that oil is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And so it's hard not to look at this and see that across multiple fronts, and this is the other value of trying to educate ourselves about the international dimension, is that we can see that what's happening to us as blacks and Chicanos here in the United States is also happening at the international level.
Right.
So it's amazing to me. I remember right after the 1980 election when Ronald Reagan was elected president, and the great musician Gil Scott Heron wrote a song, and in the song he said, you know, when white people were feeling afraid and too scared to face the future, they wanted to look backward and they wanted to look to the past when they controlled everything, not only internally, but in the world as a whole, or at least in this hemisphere. And as he said, they looked for people like John Wayne, but since he was dead, they had to settle for Ronald Reagan. And now it's the same situation, right?
With Trump.
Where white folks are scared of the demographics, they're scared of losing white privilege, and John Wayne's not around to help them, so they settle for Donald Trump.
Right.
And you see this again. We talked about this, A'Jamal, I think a couple of years ago in one of our book discussions when we talked about a Chicana scholar named Cristina Beltran, and she wrote about, as Barrera did, the settlement of the United States Southwest and how white settlers stole all the land from Native Americans and Mexican people in the Southwest. And she talked about cruelty being the point, that literally this is how white people defined their freedom by
Right.
the ability to murder Native Americans and Chicanos and steal their land, and the ability to have slaves, to own slaves.
Right.
That was freedom to white people. And now we're seeing in 2025, almost 2026, white folks defining their freedom by their ability to elect somebody who's going to send Gestapo in to communities of color to manhandle people, to disappear people, who's going to send the military to drop bombs on people with no due process. And this the United States Supreme Court, going back to the days of the Dred Scott decision,
Right.
basically,
Right.
Brett Kavanaugh saying that it's okay to racially profile Mexicans, that if they stop you and beat you up and put you in handcuffs, eventually you'll show that you're a citizen, right? And then it's okay. So it's a minor inconvenience. So this is all taking us back to the 1940s and 1950s when, as Beltran said, cruelty is the point. And so the issues are illuminated, I think, by what we see at the international level.
Patrick, one thing that also hit me as you were talking is at some point we got to get the education of our communities out there to know that this didn't happen overnight, and also that there's a pattern what they bring to our communities, basically what they did during the enslavement. And it comes to mind the episode that you and I talked about, the brutal killings of Mexicans in the Southwest and gotten away with it. In other words, there were lynchings that went on, and some of us don't know that, but they just outright shot people and buried them. And then I interviewed this scholar, white scholar, who is from southern Texas, and he had a lot of examples of where there were killings that were documented by the sheriff, and then the other folks they call the rangers in that
Okay.
part of the world, where they just got away with just shooting people and doing kinds of things. There was no due process. They didn't have a public safety auditor back then and that. And he says there's so many historical oral traditions where people describe where they got away with it, like they've done in Nebraska. And for example, the United and Nebraska, there's probably at least 50 cases of Adams Fletcher Sass documents of police brutality and killings of black folks and Hispanics in this city. That not one police officer is going to jail. So this scholar from one of the university or colleges in Texas, had his whole article, and he's written a book about that. And again, what's unfortunate is that some of us of color don't necessarily read stuff like that, or we don't use it to help motivate us to stop the onslaught that's going on today. And the thing that's happening in Israel is a manifestation of the mentality that's happened in history. And we should be able to work with that within our institutions of learning in our communities to reverse it and stop it. So that's one of my concerns. One of the things I was going to ask you is the racist term banana republic has been used by whites in the U.S. to describe Latin American nations that, excuse me, tolerate corrupt leaders that enrich themselves by using harsh laws enforcement to maintain order. And considering Trump and his family's self-enrichment through cryptocurrency and deals with the Saudis and Qatar and so on and other countries, does the United States now qualify as a banana republic?
Mm. Yes, it does. And you're right, the banana republic is a racist term, and I don't like to use it, but it does apply to the United States now. I can remember listening to a segment on National Public Radio years ago, and they were interviewing a journalist from a Latin American country. And the journalist was being asked by a reporter from the United States, is it really true that there's one of the candidates for president of your country is campaigning from inside a jail cell? And the journalist from that country said yes, that he's a former president, he's running again, and he was arrested and convicted of bribery, accepting bribes. He's in jail. He's campaigning from jail. And the U.S. journalist said, "Well, how can a country elect somebody president when they've been convicted of bribery and they're spending time in jail?" And they said, "Look, this guy did a lot of good things for the country. That's how people perceive him.
Right.
That's what people think. As long as that person took care of me, and as long as I got something from that person, I don't care if they enrich themselves in the process." And it was proven, yeah, the guy did take bribes. I think he admitted he took bribes. But a lot of people in the country felt that's okay,
Right.
as long
Right.
as he was still doing a good job otherwise. And so that's where we are with Trump. You'd have to be, I hate to use this terminology, but you'd have to be deaf, dumb, and blind to not see how Trump and his family are enriching themselves at the expense of the taxpayers. With all this cryptocurrency, with all his deals, right now he's basically trying to get Ukraine to surrender so that him and his family can do investments in Russia.
Right.
That he wants to take over Venezuela and kick Nicolas Maduro out of office so that the United States, him and his cronies, can go into Venezuela, steal the oil, and make a fortune from selling the oil.
Right.
And so, but the stakeholders that support Trump, his base, and there's two main ones that I could reference. One is the evangelical Christians who want a Christian dictator. They don't want a democracy in the United States. They want a Christian, or at least a pseudo Christian dictator. And then the other one, again, are the non college educated whites, the white supremacists, the Proud Keepers, the Oath Keepers, I should say, and the Proud Boys, that, that know that Trump will maintain white privilege. And so they don't care if he enriches himself in the process. And the Supreme Court that he's handpicked doesn't care if he enriches himself. So, yes, by virtue of all that, the United States has now acquired the status of a real banana republic. And in fact, it's probably the most glaring example that exists in the world today.
Patrick, one thing I kind of differ a little bit with you, and I point this out because I've worked with white liberals and white Confederacies and daughters of Confederates. Some of these white folks who have advanced degrees still support Trump, and they'll go behind the ballot box to support him. And I'm not going to mention somebody's name, but I work with a white female who told me she would not vote for Hillary Clinton because she felt she was immoral. And I shook my head, and this particular female had a law degree. And I'm like, how does that work out? You rather let this guy gets in because you want to hold her to higher standards or whatever. But my point back to you is you'll be surprised the number of folks who you think are your friends, and I see them all the time. I've been in meetings with many of these white female liberals and quasi-religious people. I use the word quasi here because sometimes I don't know what their religion is by the way they behave. But they literally support Trump because deep down they have benefits and privileges they've gotten. They don't want to lose it. And again, you can tell that by the fact, I'll give you two quick examples. In my lifetime, I don't think the public auditor of state Nebraska has ever been to North and South. I'm going to talk to a community group who's grassroots. We got Senator Deb Fisher, who's a U.S. Senator. She's never, to my knowledge, been talking to people who live in North and South. I'm all from a grassroots level. You look at all these organizations, institutions, Habitat for Humanity. They have a white female making well over 200,000 a year. They don't engage their families on the level of public policy or what do you do after you get the house? How do you help change policies so that people are not homeless? So my point is that even though some of these folks do have college educations, they still support Trump. And all you gotta do is look at the University of Omaha, how they reacted to our paper, Metro, all these places, quiet as a church mouse when they should be on the forefront teaching young people how to advocate and fight for themselves. Because again, the greatest benefit for those individual advocates, they would get changes in the system. So you and I would not have some of these conversations.
Well, you're absolutely right. There are a lot of well-educated whites that have positions where they're supposedly serving people of color. I see this in colleges and universities all the time. A lot of our colleges and universities are run by white people who are supposedly liberals that are doing nothing substantive to increase equity for people of color. And as a colleague of mine said, they're like looters. They're like looters during a riot. You know, the educational system is going down the drain. Our students are the ones suffering, and
Right.
they're making hundreds of thousands of dollars every year running those institutions into the ground. And they're like looters running around the streets with stolen televisions during a riot.
Right, right. By the way, I encountered a woman, a professor at UNO, who did a great study, a community survey in North Omaha some years ago. And after she finished with it, she got paid like maybe $5,000 for one of these nonprofits in Omaha. And after it was all over, I said, well, what happened? She said, my hands are washed. I've got paid and it's for the community or y'all to do something with it. But she said, I have nothing to do with it. So basically, she was like I want to call her a Confederate type what do you call those kind of people? Like somebody who just goes and sell their services, even though it's a great article and research she did, there was no follow through on her part because she felt she's done her share. And I understand some of that. But again, when you can deconstruct the disparities in our community and get some voices of those who's at the bottom, because many of us don't do that, she basically walked away. And this is a school of social work. So at the end of the day, like I would argue, you can get rid of Black studies, social work, education, a lot of those departments, because they're not serving the communities who have some of the greatest needs. They're enriching their pockets. And if you look at the amount of money that many of them make, again, I'm not against higher education, but there was a time where higher education was vested in communities trying to change systems. And now they're all running scared, not doing anything. We got about 10 minutes left. I want to ask you another question here. If we can get to it, it's called there's an article in the Atlanta Monthly that speaks to the lack of literacy and reading in society. How important is reading articles and writing from your perspective? And again, you work in academic institutions for many years. You work with kids who are marginalized, who first generation. I guess you did that also in Omaha at South High School with some of the folks. But from your perspective, how important is that? And also, if you had to cite some books or things that impacted your life, you talked about one or two there. What would you cite and what would you recommend for us to do as to deal with this literacy and writing thing? As people of color.
Yeah, I think it's tremendously important. I know this is the day and age we're living in now, when it seems like people don't read books as much anymore. And I don't often quote rappers or hip hop artists, but I did happen to see Chuck D from Public Enemy on television not too long ago, and he said something that stuck with me. He said, you have to learn, you have to read and write, man. You want to create change in society, you have to read and write. And if you are a scroller, you are not reading. You are
Right,
not a reader. And if you post, if you're a poster, you're not a writer.
right,
That's not writing. And for me, I don't know how, I think there's no shortcut to it, man. You have to read. You want to learn about an issue, you have to read. When I was in my doctoral program, I had a professor who, if we wanted to learn about a certain topic in higher education, we had to do a literature review. We had to not only read, but write a summary of all the literature that had been written about that particular topic. Because she also believed there's no shortcut to it.
right, right.
So, you know, there's another great Chicano scholar that I respect a lot named Daniel Solorzano. And he earned his PhD the same place I did, the Claremont Graduate University in California. And he writes about what he calls transformative resistance. That there are all kinds of resistance. Some of it is actually dysfunctional, but in order for there to really be transformative resistance, you have to have a commitment to social justice. And again, this takes us back to the first question we talked about, like how do you stay focused and committed? That comes from your heart. You have to have a commitment to social justice. But you also have to have a critique of oppression. So that was the second part he mentioned. You have to have a critique of oppression. And the only way you get that is by learning, by reading. You asked, like, what are some of the important books or influential books? And there have been so many of them, but one of them was a book called Occupied America
Mm,
by the great Chicano historian Rodolfo Acuña. So it's basically a lengthy, comprehensive history of Chicanos in the United States. When I was in college, I read the autobiography of Malcolm X, one of the most influential books that I've read. I read an anthology of works called Chicano Psychology about the time that I was working on my master's degree, and that had a big impact on me. Another book I would mention was a book called, or is a book called Mexico Profundo, or Profound Mexico. And it was written by a Mexican anthropologist named Gonzalo Bonfil Batalla. And this book is about really the racial and cultural origins of Mexicans. You know, when I was in the early days of the Chicano movement in the 1970s, and you know, we used to have this very sort of romanticized image of Chicanos as Mexican people as mestizos, you know, as Indian and Spanish.
Right.
That we were the product of the indigenous Mexican Indians that were the original inhabitants of Mexico, and the Spanish that came from Europe later on. What Bonfil Batalla argues as an anthropologist is that, and I've seen this argued by others, that there were never really that many Spanish people in Mexico, and that the Mexican people are not really mestizos as much as we are indigenous, as he called it, de-Indianized Indians. That we are Indian peoples with a little bit of European, and that's our both our racial makeup and our culture.
Hmm.
So that's what he called the authentic Mexico, and basically that the Mexico that we see in the soap operas, right? The Spanish-speaking soap operas, the novelas. That's like a false Mexico, man. And the real authentic Mexico is the culture that belongs to the indigenous people of Mexico. So that book had a real profound influence on me, and so yeah, my life has been greatly shaped by numerous books that I've read, and I'm always looking for the next really good book like that to read.
And Patrick, one of the reasons I raised that, I know we're getting close to the end, is that I'm trying to start a book reading group. And that's difficult when you have a lot of people who are literate or they've come through this plantation education that don't teach them basic skills. Some obviously suffer from dyslexia. Some suffer from the fact that they've never had books and growing up through their system of using books as a ways of educating themselves. And I sometimes find it disingenuous when somebody says, well, the research says this or it says that. Well, show me exactly where you got it from. And again, you got a lot of folks in our community who go to Facebook and get their knowledge there. You can tell they're dumber than rocks. And again, we got a lot of leadership who have nothing but GEDs. Again, I'm not mad at GEDs because Malcolm didn't graduate from high school, but Malcolm studied so much and when he was in prison and elsewhere. And I see a number of people that I wish I could have a lobotomy so I could have a conversation with them. They're that dumb, seriously. But how do you go a lifetime being in leadership or making $200,000 or $300,000 a year, and you have no piece of paper of legacy of what you left of helping us in our struggle, particularly when the struggle elevated you to get your job in the first place. So, in other words, many of our families and mothers and fathers and grandparents didn't fight in the struggle for somebody to get in the job and all of a sudden to sell us down the river. So, reading is important. And so, again, when we're reading a book, you're looking at the literature, and again, that's how I've learned a lot is by reading and writing and being able to captivate some key ideas. And last point, there are a number of white scholars I've encountered in the last few years, some in Creighton and elsewhere, who've written about racism, but they write it from a jaundiced point of view of their white privilege, and they need more input if they're going to come out in a balanced way. And so it's like me writing about women's issues, and I despise women, or I don't have any women in my life. That's the mentality of what we deal with in our community. So one of the things I really want to emphasize is you got to read, and it's hard to be knowledgeable of stuff and then try to communicate to folks who refuse to use the literature. And in actual fact, when you have vast libraries, are underutilized because we're afraid of that and we think the library is like a prison cell and we won't go in there. So on that note, I'd like to say, Patrick, thank you for sharing with us this kind of a insight about many experiences that we experience as people of color, both nationally, internationally, and how we as activists need to be very much focused on dealing with those issues. But before we close down, any last comments on your part?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention as an example of what you just talked about in San Diego. Actually, the gentleman who is my co-chair in the San Diego Concilio is a professor at San Diego State named Isidro Ortiz. And Dr. Ortiz, he holds book reading sessions every so often with primarily Chicano teachers from an organization here in San Diego called the Association of Raza Educators. It's a group of Chicano public school teachers. So they meet with Dr. Ortiz regularly, and they choose a book and they read the book together. They discuss the book, they analyze it, and that's the kind of thing that I think more of us should do. And the last thing I'll say is that it's great to read, but man, if you're going to read a lot, you need to write also, and especially if you got a PhD, and if you're a person of color, you got a PhD. The only reason you did it was to get a better job. Shame on you, man,
Right.
because you got to write. You're supposed to be a scholar. You need to write, as you said, A'Jamal. Even just writing letters to policymakers, writing letters to the newspaper. But yeah, that's so important.
Well, Patrick, thank you very much. And we hope you've enjoyed this edition of Throwing Out Some Heavy Light. And I hope you join us again as we continue forward with these conversations that they won't cover in our local media. And it's very important. So, as we say, may the force be with you. Baroko.